Welcome to Dead Quiet Mysteries, where every silence hides a secret waiting to be uncovered. New moon symbol. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop your city and country in the comments below. Globe showing Europe Africa detective ###. Chapter 1, The Circle of Light. The annual fair had come to Ashcombe like a painted apostle, gaudy, loud, and faintly devout, with its little shrines of coconut shies, hoopla stalls, and tinny hymns played by the wheezing steam organ. The October sky held that flat pewter glow which can make even brass look pale. The air smelled of fried batter, wet grass, and optimism. Father Brown, with his battered umbrella under one arm, had been asked, by someone vague enough not to be found again, to bless the travelling folk. This blessing was accomplished with nothing more ecclesiastical than a nod, a kindly word, and the eating of a bun that tasted faintly of dust and cinnamon. He turned up the collar of his shabby coat against a rain that had not yet arrived but had been threatening the horizon all afternoon like an offended relative. From the green, one could see Ashcombe Manor, a hulk of grey stone squatting behind a ragged avenue of elms, looking across at the fair with the sullen charity of an old aristocrat who has seen better centuries. Its towers were not high enough to be proud, only high enough to be lonely. Windows stared like hooded eyes. Chimneys stood like idle sentries. Inside the manor dwelt Lord Ashcombe, a collector of medals, rare books, and enemies, Lady Ashcombe, who was patient to the point of artistry, Dr. Martha Keene, a scholarly woman who could read more Latin than most bishops, Sir Peregrine Vale, a country neighbour and professional skeptic, who disbelieved in everything except his own skepticism, Mr. Hobbs the butler, whose back was permanently bowed, whether from service or secrecy, Annie, the parlour maid, who possessed 3 ribbons and 1 great fear, and a handful of other souls who kept the grand old house just this side of the grave. By late afternoon, the sky darkened decisively. A wind came down the valley with the hiss of paper being torn, and the fairground lamps began to wink in defiance of the storm. Inside Ashcombe Manor, the household lit candles against the flickering indecision of the electric lights. With the candles came all the old superstitions, tiptoeing back into the rooms as if they had never left, shadows that listened, doors that whispered, and the creeping sense that one could hear the past thinking. Lord Ashcombe had retired to his study, a room of creaking leather chairs, tall shelves, and the smell of old paper. It had a door that locked with an obstinate clunk and a window that would not open far enough to forgive even a raindrop. The lord of the manor pretended to despise the thunder and sat down to examine a bundle of letters with the practiced disapproval of a man sorting his own virtues. At 10 minutes to 9, the peace broke in a curious fashion. The parlour bell rang, a sharp, urgent peal, the kind that makes a butler start before he remembers himself. Annie jumped, dropping her duster. Somewhere upstairs, Lady Ashcombe closed a book without finishing the sentence. Mr. Hobbs took up a tray of letters and went to the study. He knocked, and a peevish voice told him to leave them and go away. He obeyed, because obedience was the most ordinary form of courage in that kind of house. At 9:05, the thunder rolled away like an accusation that had lost interest. Hobbs returned to the study door to collect the tray. He knocked. No answer. He tried the handle. The door was locked. The key was plainly visible on the inside, its ornate bow just under the lip of the keyhole, like a tongue in a shut mouth. By now there was a certain unease in the air. Lady Ashcombe was summoned. She brought with her a certain cool command that did not wait for explanations. A gardener fetched a crowbar. After some grunting and a loud metallic sigh, the door yielded. The study was lit not by its dim electric lamp but by a dozen candles set upon the floor in a perfect circle around the desk. Within that circle, Lord Ashcombe lay sprawled beside his chair, a pistol in his right hand. The smell of burnt powder, cordite, hung in the air like an afterthought. On the black hearth, scrawled in chalk, was a single word, Lux. Latin, announced Sir Peregrine, stepping into the room with the entitlement of a man who explains the obvious. It means a light dot. Light, repeated Dr. Keene, her voice lower. But misquoted. From Genesis, yes, but this is stripped bare, without its command. And the circle, she trailed off, frowning. Suicide, of course, said Inspector Gryce, a square-shouldered man with a voice like a snapped ruler, summoned from the village. Locked room, gun in hand, some theatricals to confuse the coroner. They do that in penny papers. Father Brown, who had been fetched almost as an afterthought from the fair, said nothing at first. He stood, small and round, just inside the door, his eyes blinking behind his spectacles. He looked at the candles as one might look at children who had been caught at mischief. Odd, he murmured at last. What is? Asked Sir Peregrine with an indulgent smile. The candles, said the priest. They're placed to frighten the dark, not the living. Sir Peregrine chuckled. You priests see symbolism in the breakfast toast. Father Brown bent a little, peering at the word on the hearth. He was afraid of the dark, he said, almost to himself. How on earth do you know that? The skeptic pressed. Father Brown straightened up. Because there are many ways to arrange candles in a circle. But only one way to arrange them as if you want no shadow near your chair. Lady Ashcombe, pale but unshaken, looked from the chalk to the little priest. Then what, father, do you think frightened him? Father Brown turned towards the rain-spattered window. Sometimes, he said, it is not the darkness we fear, but what light might show us. Outside, the storm gathered itself for another strike, the fairgrounds organ piping gamely against the wind, while in Ashcombe Manor a strange unease settled, a feeling that what had happened was not over, but only just begun. Chapter 2, Faces at Ashcombe. The household had gathered in the long drawing-room, that solemn parliament of furniture and faces where nothing ever happened quickly. The walls were hung with portraits that stared down like witnesses too proud to speak. A scent of candle wax and rain crept in through the half-shut windows. Outside, the storm had retreated a little, rolling its artillery off to the far hills. The rain still tapped at the panes, irregular as an impatient questioner. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with the slow arrogance of time deciding the future. Lady Ashcombe sat upright in a high-backed chair, her posture as composed as her pale hands in her lap. She had the stillness of someone who neither invites nor resists sympathy. Dr. Martha Keene, in a dark wool dress, leaned slightly forward, her eyes sharp but not unkind, a scholar's eyes, taking in data and waiting to see if it would form a theory. Sir Peregrine Vale stood near the mantel, leaning on it with one elbow in the studied pose of a man photographed for a public lecture. His face wore the tolerant half-smile of someone listening to a fairy tale, willing to be amused. Mr. Hobbs the butler hovered discreetly by the door, as if ready to escort either a guest or a ghost from the room. Annie the parlourmaid sat primly in a small chair by the wall, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. She had already cried, and so, ironically, looked less distressed than the rest. Inspector Gryce stood squarely before the fireplace, his notebook out, his tone dry. It's clear enough, he said. The man locks his door, sets the stage with candles and chalk, then shoots himself. What we don't yet know is whether the message, this Latin word, is a religious statement, a superstition, or just a bit of theatre. Bit of theatre, Sir Peregrine repeated with a light laugh. Ashcombe had a taste for melodrama. The candles, the chalk, he would have liked to trouble the coroner. I do not believe in melodrama, Dr. Keene said quietly. Nor in curses. But arrangements interest me. Those candles were not placed at random. And that chalk word, lux, has a child's simplicity. It is light without context. Lux, said Sir Peregrine, isn't that simply Genesis without the introduction? Dr. Keene gave him a sidelong glance. Genesis begins with a command, fiat lux, let there be light. The imperative matters. Without it, the word sits there like a lamp without a switch. Lady Ashcombe's voice entered the discussion like a cool draught. My husband, she said, enjoyed the idea of his soul as an auction room. He liked to believe he could sell anything, even the contents of heaven, if they fetched a good price. Father Brown, seated quietly in a corner with a cup of tea Annie had brought him, spoke so softly that Annie nearly spilled the saucer. Did his lordship keep a second key to the study? Lady Ashcombe turned her gaze upon him as though weighing the question. No. The key is large and vulgar, like some of his opinions. There is but one, and you saw it in the lock. The priest nodded, sipping his tea, his eyes roving towards the rain-blurred garden. A peacock stood there in the wet grass, its bedraggled tail spread like an afterthought, as if the bird had dressed for a grand event that had been cancelled without notice. Tell me, Inspector Gryce went on, Sir Peregrine, you last saw his lordship alive at what hour? 25 minutes past 8, the baronet replied, still leaning on the mantel. We quarrelled, though that's hardly unusual. He threatened to sell the Ashcombe manuscripts to some vulgar collector. I told him his ancestors would rise from their tombs and beat him with their thigh bones. He seemed amused. You left by the main door. I did. The rain had not yet decided to arrive, though the wind was having strong opinions about it. And you, Dr. Keene? The inspector asked. I saw him at 7, she said. He asked whether a letter he had discovered in the margin of the Bede commentary would be worth money. I told him most marginalia are like whispers, they lose their value when repeated in public. Lady Ashcombe gave a slight smile. My husband enjoyed discovering the private writings of the dead. It gave him a sense of being clever without the inconvenience of being original. Mr. Hobbs shifted behind her chair. If I may, sir, he said to the inspector, when I took in the letters at 10 to 9, he sounded, well, quite sound. Irritable, but that was common enough. Told me to leave the tray and go. And the candles? Father Brown asked without looking up from his tea. Hobbs frowned slightly. Not lit when I first went in. Annie fetched them later, when the lights flickered with the storm. All eyes turned to Annie. She swallowed. I saw a shadow in the corridor before the bell rang. Tall gentleman, wearing a cloak. Most tall gentlemen wear their height like a cloak, Sir Peregrine observed dryly. No, sir, she said, twisting her apron again. This one had a hat that looked wet. Like rain. Father Brown put down his cup, walked over to the door, and bent to inspect the runner that lined the corridor outside. His stubby fingers pinched at something invisible, and came up with a minuscule filament, barely there, yet glistening faintly like the thread of a spider. People, he said gently, tie themselves in knots, and then blame the string. The inspector raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Father Brown looked round at the assembly, his expression as mild as ever. Only that some locks are open not by force, but by invitation. And sometimes, the invitation is very thin indeed. A brief silence followed, one of those small, taut silences in which everyone feels a little more visible than they would like. The rain's tapping at the windows seemed suddenly more insistent, as though the night itself wanted to join the conversation. Chapter 3, The Scholar and the Skeptic. The library of Ashcombe Manor had the dignity of a cathedral and the draught of a barn. Shelves stretched to the high, shadowed ceiling, groaning under the weight of Latin tomes, foxed atlases, and novels that looked as though they had been read in gloves. The fire was reluctant, as if conscious of being watched by so much dry paper. Father Brown found Dr. Martha Keene there, seated at a long oak table between a Roman poet and an English kettle, both equally dusty. She was a woman who could silence a noisy room without raising her voice, simply by holding a thought in her eyes until it became contagious. You are thinking about the candles, Father Brown said, removing his hat and perching on the edge of a chair. I am thinking, she replied, that the arrangement was deliberate, but foolish, like most blasphemies. A circle with the word lux at its heart, this is not the work of a scholar. It is an imitation of ritual. The sort of thing a man imagines will impress those who know less than he does. Father Brown folded his hands. He wanted to frighten us. Perhaps, she said, but I do not frighten easily. The priest's small eyes crinkled. It is harder to frighten those who know the dark than those who deny it. Her head turned a little. You think it was murder? I think it was a human act, he answered. And human acts are always more interesting than death by accident. Dr. Keene studied him for a moment. You are unlike some priests, Father. You do not begin with heaven. I'm a parish priest, he said cheerfully. I begin where the parish is, and in this case, the parish is here, with a locked room, an inconvenient corpse, and too many theories. Her thin mouth quirked in a shadow of amusement. I suppose you will leave the physical evidence to Inspector Gryce. Physical evidence, said Father Brown, is like a man's overcoat. It may keep him warm, but it does not tell you the color of his soul. From the library they went into the smoking room, a smaller, cozier chamber with the scent of old tobacco soaked into the panelled walls. Here Sir Peregrine Vale was arranging himself in an armchair, legs crossed, cigarette in hand. He greeted the priest with a cordiality that had the faint aftertaste of condescension. Father, he said, come to enlist me in your campaign against suicide? Or do you propose to prove that a demon entered the study, arranged a liturgical circle, and shot poor Ashcombe for misquoting Genesis? Father Brown settled himself into a seat opposite, as unthreatening as a teapot. I should be satisfied with proving that a man walked into the room and a worse man walked out. Sir Peregrine laughed, a light, patrician laugh. You do enjoy your paradoxes. I am fond of the truth when it is shy, said the priest. It often wears a paradox like a brown coat. And what, may I ask, is your shy truth this evening? That the candles were not for mysticism, but for concealment. That the word in chalk was not theology, but theatre. And that whoever wrote it knew just enough Latin to be dangerous. Sir Peregrine tapped ash delicately into the tray. You will find that in this county, Father, Latin is mostly left to tombstones. I read Horace at Eton, but I'm sure I have misquoted him ever since. Father Brown nodded gravely. It is possible to read Horace without understanding why he wrote. Just as it is possible to quote scripture without understanding why it was spoken. The baronet smiled again, though the smile was tighter. I see you are fond of moral fencing. Only, replied the priest, with those who already have the sword. Sir Peregrine leaned back. So tell me, who do you suspect? I suspect, Father Brown said slowly, that Lord Ashcombe's death was arranged by someone who feared what he might reveal, and feared it enough to dress the crime in candlelight and mystery. But that is not the same as knowing who. You think, Sir Peregrine drawled, that our late host had some piece of scandal up his sleeve. I think, said the priest, he was the kind of man who kept other people's secrets not out of kindness, but out of greed. And greed is an unreliable custodian. The skeptic's expression sharpened for the briefest moment. And if you found the culprit, would you hand them over to the police? I would hand them over to God first, the priest said simply. Then we could see if the police were still needed. Sir Peregrine laughed again, but more softly this time, as if unwilling to wake something sleeping in the conversation. Well, Father, I shall be in my rooms. I intend to write an essay on the benefits of candour and the necessity of tact. Father Brown stood, placing his hat back on his head. They rarely attend the same party, you know. The baronet raised his cigarette in salute. Perhaps not, but I like to think myself an accommodating host. As Father Brown left the smoking room, he reflected that candour and tact were indeed both present in Ashcombe Manor tonight, but in separate rooms, and neither entirely comfortable with the other's company. Chapter 4, The Servants' Corridor. The servants' corridor of Ashcombe Manor was a world apart from the formal chambers above, a narrow artery of worn rugs, the faint smell of soap and onions, and the quiet rhythm of work that rarely altered for the dramas upstairs. It was the sort of place you only found if you already knew it existed, and, once inside, you half wondered how the grand rooms managed to live without it. Father Brown made his way there in the manner of a man not so much trespassing as wandering home. The electric lights buzzed faintly overhead. Here they had not flickered during the storm. The priest found Mr. Hobbs standing at a long counter, polishing a piece of silver shaped like a bird that had long ago given up any hope of flight. "Sad business, Father," Hobbs said without looking up, his cloth moving with the slow devotion of habit. His lordship took his mind very seriously, which is always dangerous to a gentleman. Father Brown smiled faintly. "Did you hear the parlour bell at 10 to 9? "Sharp on the minute," Hobbs said. "The bell for the study is a peevish little thing. Has a voice like slate being scratched. Makes you feel you've done wrong before you've even got there." Was it usual for his lordship to ring at that hour? When troubled, Hobbs replied. He rang like some men pray, suddenly, and with a touch of urgency. But that night, he told me to leave the letters and go. Sound enough in his voice, I thought. Irritable, but that was common. The priest tilted his head. "You noticed nothing unusual in the study?" "Nothing, Father." The lights were on then. Candles not yet lit. Annie fetched them later, when the electricity played its games. Father Brown's eyes narrowed, but kindly. "And when you came back 5 minutes later?" "Door was locked," said Hobbs. "Key in the lock, same as you saw it." And silence, like a church after everyone's gone home. "Thank you, Mr. Hobbs," the priest said, and shuffled on, following the smell of starch and warm water. He found Annie in the laundry room, folding a sheet with more concentration than the task required. Her 3 ribbons, 2 blue and 1 red, had been retied since the events of the evening, but her fingers still worked the cloth as though afraid of what they might do if left idle. "Annie," Father Brown said gently, "you told the inspector you saw a shadow in the corridor." She glanced at him quickly. "Yes, Father." Before the bell rang. "A tall gentleman, in a cloak." "Most tall gentlemen wear their height like a cloak," he said, "but did you notice his face?" "No, Father." "Just the hat, wide brim, dripping. Looked like rain." Father Brown leaned on the edge of the counter. "This corridor leads to the study." "Yes, sir. But the servant's door is usually bolted on the inside." "Usually," the priest echoed, "but not always." She hesitated. "Sometimes it's left unbolted when someone important is expected who doesn't want to use the front." "Discretion," Father Brown said softly. "One of the trades in which this corridor deals." As Annie lowered her eyes, the priest knelt suddenly and pinched something from the old runner that lined the passage. He straightened, holding between his thumb and forefinger a tiny, waxed filament, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. "Thread," Annie said uncertainly. "Yes," Father Brown replied. "The sort a fisherman might use, or someone fishing for a key." The girl blinked. "How can you fish for a key?" "By giving it the smallest of tugs," the priest said. "Like coaxing a stubborn child. You thread the string through the keyhole, loop it round the bow of the key, and pull. Turn, lift, draw back, and the lock is yours. Like magic." "Like sin," Father Brown said, slipping the filament into his pocket. "It looks easy from the outside, but it's harder to live with once you're in." The laundry room seemed smaller then, as though the walls had crept closer. Somewhere beyond, a door closed with deliberate softness. Father Brown retraced his steps to the main corridor, pausing now and then to rest his hand on the wall as though feeling for a pulse. In the dim light, the place felt almost monastic, bare boards, plain doors, an occasional coat hook like a frozen gesture. He thought of cloisters where silence was holy, and of corridors like this one where silence was merely useful. Near the back stairs, he met Hobbs again, carrying a tray of untouched tea. No one wanted refreshment, the priest asked. Hobbs shook his head. Not tonight, Father. The young footman swore he heard the study bell again just after the door was found locked, but that's impossible. Not impossible, Father Brown murmured, merely unwise. A bell can be pulled from the inside by a hand, or from the outside by a thread. Hobbs frowned. What sort of person would bother with all that instead of simply knocking? The sort, Father Brown said quietly, who wishes to be in the room without anyone remembering how they got there. At the far end of the corridor, Annie reappeared with an armful of folded linen. She avoided the study door as though it were a sleeping dog. Father Brown lingered for a moment, listening. The sounds of the servants' wing were modest and orderly, pots being stacked, a kettle boiling, a faint hum of a hymn from the scullery. But underneath it all there was something taut, like the silence between two lines of a quarrel. As he turned to leave, the priest looked back once at the long strip of carpet, the polished brass keyholes, the heavy doors. It was a place built for passing unseen, for errands unremarked. And yet tonight, it seemed to him, it had been used for something else, something halfway between a visit and a trespass. And the trouble with trespasses, Father Brown reflected as he climbed back toward the drawing room, was that they could be committed in the mind long before the body followed. Chapter 5, The Philosopher Under the Tent. By the time Father Brown returned to the village green, the fair had recovered from the storm's interruption with the stubborn cheerfulness peculiar to travelling shows. Strings of bulbs swung overhead, shedding their uneven light on puddled grass. The air was full of competing smells, burnt sugar, damp canvas, and the acrid tang of cheap fireworks. A row of tents flapped softly in the wind. Most offered something obvious, cakes, cheap trinkets, dubious fortunes. But one stood apart, its faded stripes making it look older than the rest, as though it had been pitched in this very spot every autumn for 100 years. Above its entrance hung a sign that read in curling paint, Mr. Lark's lecture on the art of living without paying for it. Inside, the tent was close and smelled faintly of lamp oil. A few benches faced a makeshift stage, a raised plank with a red cloth. Mr. Lark himself, a lean man with nimble fingers and eyes that twinkled like someone who knew the punchline before he began the joke, was speaking to a thin scattering of onlookers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "life is a lockbox, and the trick is not to ask for the key." The small audience chuckled. Some of them had the look of people hoping for an actual trick, others the look of people hoping for an actual box. When the talk ended, most wandered out to look for more edible entertainment. Father Brown remained seated until the last had gone, then shuffled forward. "Good evening, Mr. Lark," he said. The showman grinned. "Ah. The man in the brown hat. Did you enjoy my sermon on economy?" "I enjoyed the part about boxes," the priest replied mildly. "I wanted to ask you about keys." Lark leaned an elbow on the edge of the stage. "Ah. The universal language. What sort of keys?" "The sort that open doors without a man being in the room to turn them." The showman's eyes brightened. "A bad conscience, Father. That's the commonest sort. But I expect you mean the mechanical trick, yes. If you don't mind explaining." "It's simple enough," Lark said, reaching into his pocket for a coil of fine, dark thread. "You pass this under the door and up through the keyhole. Loop it round the bow of the key, like a slipknot round a fishhook. A gentle pull turns it, a lift slides the latch. You can burn the thread if you're in a hurry, snap it if you're careful, or just pull it back the way it came. Done neatly, no one notices. And if someone wanted to be noticed, then they'd add something flashy," Lark replied with a shrug. "A candlelit circle, a fancy word, a whiff of the supernatural. You make the audience look at the stage, not the trap door." Father Brown nodded slowly. "The audience, yes. And the stage. Lark grinned. You've got the idea. I've known men who could open a safe in the dark but wouldn't be trusted to arrange the flowers without telling the world. Showmanship's a curse, Father. The priest's voice was mild, almost regretful. And sometimes the curse is in wanting to frighten rather than merely deceive. Lark's grin faded into a more thoughtful smile. True enough. I've met men who'd rather scare you into obedience than steal from you outright. Father Brown glanced at the small table of props beside the stage, a padlock with its shackle open, a pack of cards splayed like a fan, a painted handle promising philosophy for the price of a cup of tea. Tell me, he asked, do you always teach the trick as well as perform it? Only to those who've already guessed it, Lark replied. That way it's not teaching, just confirming. And what if the trick's been used for murder? The showman's eyes flicked to the priest's face. Then it's not a trick anymore. It's a sin with good publicity. They stood for a moment in the close lamplight, the flapping of the tent canvas punctuated by the cries of the fair beyond. Finally Lark said, if you've got yourself a murderer who used thread, he wasn't a professional. A professional would have kept it plain. This one, if there is one, wanted to be remembered for the performance. That, Father Brown said quietly, is almost the whole truth. Lark tilted his head. And the other part? That the performance was not for the police, the priest said, nor for the household. It was for one man only. And the tragedy is that the audience did not live to applaud or to protest. The showman slipped the thread back into his pocket. Sounds like you're halfway to catching him, Father. I'm halfway to understanding him, the priest corrected. And once you understand a man, you've got to decide whether to save him or stop him. Sometimes you have to do both. Lark chuckled. You priests are dangerous men. Only, Father Brown replied, to those who think they can lock a door against God. He stepped back into the night. The fair's organ was playing a jaunty tune that had outlived its composer by several generations. The puddles reflected the electric bulbs as though the ground had borrowed the stars. Somewhere in the dark, a peacock from the manor cried, a sound halfway between a trumpet and a sob. Father Brown looked once toward the looming shape of Ashcombe Manor against the sky. It was a house built for privacy, but tonight it seemed full of open doors, doors that had been opened by pride, by fear, and perhaps by the very sort of thread that now lay in Mr. Lark's pocket. The priest turned up the path toward the house, walking slowly, as if each step took him deeper into a story that was already written, yet not yet told. Chapter 6: The Theology of Candles. The study still smelled of cordite and damp wool when Father Brown stepped back inside. The room had been left much as it was found. Inspector Gryce insisted that nothing be disturbed until he had finished his notes, though his notes seemed mostly to consist of staring at the pistol and frowning. The candles still burned in their precise circle, a dozen pale flames flickering in perfect, even distance from one another. Their glow pooled on the polished boards, casting shadows that shivered at the edges like frightened animals. The chalked word LUX was smeared now, perhaps by an unwary boot or the damp in the air. Father Brown moved slowly around the circle, hands clasped behind him. It is curious, he said at last, that the candles near the door are burned down almost to their ends, while those by the desk are barely touched. Gryce glanced up from his crouch beside the body. That's draught, Father. Door side burns faster. That's doctrine, the priest said mildly. That which is nearest the open grows thinner first. The inspector rolled his eyes. You've a sermon for everything. I've a sermon because the world keeps making the same mistakes, Father Brown replied, bending to examine the floor. Near the threshold, he saw a faint, curved groove in the carpet pile, no wider than a hair, too exact to be the scuff of a shoe. He touched it with one finger, then looked at the brass keyhole above. The metal gleamed faintly in a small, unnatural ring, as if kissed by something oily. "You've been talking to that fairground fellow, haven't you?" Grice said, narrowing his gaze. "Mr. Lark understands how things are opened," the priest answered. "And also how they are disguised." He crossed to the desk, noting the untidy scatter of papers. A few sheets were clean, but most were spotted with the grey grit that comes from scraping away ink with a blade. Beside them sat an open inkwell, and beside that, the stub of a candle, not one of the 12 in the circle, but a thick, squat one, burnt only halfway down. Its wax had run irregularly, as if moved before it was cool. Father Brown touched the candle and sniffed. Beneath the ordinary scent of tallow was a faint sourness, vinegar. He looked at the inspector. "Did you notice this?" Grice shrugged. "I noticed everything." "You noticed," the priest corrected gently, "but you didn't ask why." "And why, Father, is someone's desk candle worth your trouble?" "Because vinegar is for erasing ink," Father Brown said. "And someone erased something here. Something they didn't want the rest of us to read." The inspector straightened, brushing dust from his knees. "You think this is about a letter?" "I think it's about the sort of letter that makes men do rash things," Father Brown said. Lord Ashcombe was a man who collected other people's weaknesses like some men collect stamps. And stamps, Inspector, are only valuable because someone once licked them. The inspector made a sound halfway between a snort and a cough. "You've got a suspect." "I've got a soul in trouble," the priest replied. Father Brown returned to the circle of candles. He stooped and cupped his hands round one flame near the desk, shielding it from the faint draft that came through the little open ventilator above the window. Then he moved to the candle nearest the door and did the same. The difference in height between the two flames was stark, one vigorous, one feeble, almost drowning in its own wax. He straightened and looked at Grice. "If you set candles to hide a thread stretched from door to desk, where would you place the tallest ones?" The inspector hesitated, then said, "Near the desk. They draw the eye there." "Exactly," Father Brown said. "These aren't for ceremony. They're for camouflage." He turned his gaze back to the body. Lord Ashcombe's right hand still clutched the pistol, stiff in death. But the angle of the arm, the relaxed position of the left shoulder, told the priest what the powder stains already had: the man had not been right-hand. "You've handled enough dinners to know which hand a man uses," Father Brown said. Ashcombe pointed at people with his left when he bullied them. Tonight, someone put the gun in his right. Grice exhaled sharply through his nose. "Then who locked the door?" "The same one who unlocked it after," Father Brown said. "With a thread and the nerve to work in candlelight." The inspector stared. "That's a conjurer's trick." "It's also a coward's," the priest said. "And pride is just cowardice wearing a medal." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the flames swaying faintly between them. Somewhere in the house, a door slammed. Father Brown looked at the chalk word again. "Lux," he murmured. "Light without its command." A man trying to borrow the language of creation without the authority to speak it. Whoever wrote this was playing at being God, but only to cover the fact that he had been very human indeed. He blew out the nearest candle, then another, until a gap appeared in the circle. Shadows deepened across the room. "Light should reveal," he said quietly. "When it's used to hide, it becomes a lie." Grice scratched his jaw. "You're saying you know who did this?" "I'm saying," Father Brown replied, "that I know why. And once you know why, the who is usually standing right in front of you, whether they like it or not." The inspector's gaze sharpened. "And you'll tell me?" "In time," the priest said, stepping toward the door. "But not to catch them. To save them, if I still can." He left the study, his small figure vanishing into the darkened corridor, while the remaining candles guttered faintly behind him, their flames no longer arranged in a perfect, deceptive circle. Chapter 7. Pride and Windows. Sir Peregrine Vale's rooms were at the east end of the manor, a pair of chambers done in the confident, slightly faded style of a man who had once travelled and now liked to remind people of it. A map of Europe hung on the wall, France and Italy creased from folding, the Balkans untouched. A pair of sabres crossed above the hearth, their blades dull but their symbolism polished. When Father Brown knocked, Sir Peregrine called out in a tone that suggested guests were welcome, provided they didn't stay long. "Ah, Father," he said, as the priest stepped inside. "Have you brought your verdict?" "I've brought a memory," Father Brown replied. He moved toward the window. The rain had stopped, and the glass reflected the baronet's face in faint, broken shapes. "You came to see Lord Ashcombe at 8:25. You quarrelled. Then you left, but you didn't go far." Peregrine arched an eyebrow. "You've been talking to the servants." "They talk to anyone who listens," the priest said. "You waited in the passage until Hobbs brought the tray. Then you used a waxed thread to turn the key from outside, entered, and set your stage, candles, chalk, the rest of it. You locked the door again after you left, leaving Ashcombe very much alive, for a little while." The baronet lit a cigarette with precise movements. "If I had, Father, it would still not explain how the man died." "Or why?" "It explains why the room looked like theatre," Father Brown said. "You wanted to rattle him. To show him he wasn't untouchable. To suggest that forces were closing in, forces older than his pride." "And you think fear killed him?" Peregrine asked lightly. "No," Father Brown said. "I think you came back after he laughed at you. That laugh was the wrong note in your little performance, and you couldn't bear it. You picked up his pistol, left-handed, as he always kept it, and fired." The cigarette trembled almost imperceptibly between Peregrine's fingers. "And the motive? Surely you have that ready for the sermon." "Yes," the priest said softly. "Letters. Not yours alone, but hers. Letters you wrote to a woman before she married another. Words of foolishness, perhaps tenderness, but not vice. To you they were a relic, to him, a tool. He found them among the manuscripts. He told you he'd sell them, your words, her name, to a collector who would see them in print." Peregrine's jaw tightened. "She has a family. Children. You understand, I hope, what that would have meant." "I do," Father Brown said. "I also understand you could have told the truth before he found the letters. Pride stopped you then, and pride tried to fix it tonight." The baronet flicked ash into the grate. "Do you know what it is to have your life made into a curiosity? A footnote in another man's entertainment?" "Yes," the priest said simply. "It's called being human. God himself was made into a mockery once. But he didn't light candles and play ghost to win an argument." A silence settled. Outside, the wet garden shone under a clearing sky. The peacock cried again somewhere near the lawn, a lonely trumpet call. "You make me sound small," Peregrine said at last. "I make you sound as you are," Father Brown replied. "Small enough to be forgiven, large enough to be dangerous." The baronet laughed without humour. "You mean to hand me to the police, then?" "I mean to hand you to God first," the priest said. "The police will have their turn after. You can confess before them or after, it's your choice. But if you wait too long, the choice won't be yours at all." Peregrine turned toward the window, staring out at the silvered grass. "If I confess, will you tell them about the letters?" "I'll tell them only what is needed to keep another man from hanging in your place," Father Brown said. "And I'll tell them that you tried to frighten a bully and ended up frightening yourself into sin." The baronet's shoulders dropped. He didn't even look afraid. Just amused. That's what did it. Yes, Father Brown said. Pride hates to be laughed at more than it hates to lose. The sabres above the hearth caught a glint of lamplight. Peregrine glanced at them, then back to the priest. You know, he said slowly, I thought I could arrange the scene like a work of art. Something dramatic but bloodless. A clever footnote to our quarrel. Instead, he stopped, the unspoken word heavier than any he had said aloud. Father Brown took a step toward the door. You dressed your sin like a play, Sir Peregrine. The trouble is, plays end. This one can end well, or badly, but it will end. Peregrine stubbed out his cigarette. I'll speak to Inspector Gryce. Good, said the priest. And if you find yourself tempted to make a speech, remember that truth doesn't need applause. As Father Brown left, the corridor seemed longer than before. The lamps burned steadily, and somewhere a clock struck 10. In the east wing, the baronet stood at his window, staring at the pale rim of moon climbing above the wet fields, the last curls of smoke from his cigarette fading like an old conceit in the night air. Chapter 8, A Quiet Absolution. They gathered again in the drawing-room, the same faces as before but altered, as if each had been weathered in the few hours since the study door was broken open. Lady Ashcombe sat by the hearth, her hands folded in her lap. Dr. Martha Keene was beside the window, her sharp profile softened by the lamplight. Annie lingered near the wall, keeping half in shadow. Mr. Hobbs stood at his post, the still point in the room's slow turning. Inspector Gryce remained by the mantel, notebook in hand, though his eyes were fixed on Father Brown. The priest stood not at the center of the room but by the door, as if unsure whether he had been invited to speak or had simply wandered in. He held his hat in both hands, his voice mild. We have, he began, been puzzled by a locked door, a word written in chalk, a ring of candles. The appearance of mystery is always tempting, it flatters us into thinking the solution must be equally strange. But the truth here is simpler. The door was not locked by death. It was locked by pride. The room held still. Only the faint hiss of the fire broke the quiet. The lock, Father Brown went on, was turned from outside with a loop of waxed thread. The kind you could pass through a keyhole, hook round the bow of a key, and twist until the bolt shot home. It's an old trick. The candles were not symbols of ritual but screens to hide that thread. The word lux was not a scholar's flourish, it was Latin picked up like a shiny stone, pretty to look at but empty of meaning. It was meant to draw our eyes to the floor, not the door. Dr. Keene's eyes narrowed in thought. Then the man who wrote it knew little Latin, enough to impress, not enough to be exact. Exactly, Father Brown said. And Lord Ashcombe did not fire that pistol with his right hand. He was left-handed. Whoever placed it there wanted us to believe the wrong hand had pulled the trigger. Gryce's voice was gruff. And you know who that was? I do, said the priest. It was Sir Peregrine Vale. The baronet was not in the room. Gryce's brow furrowed, but Father Brown continued. He came to the study at 8:25. They quarrelled, about manuscripts, yes, but also about letters. Letters written long ago to a woman who married another. Harmless in themselves, but in Lord Ashcombe's hands they became a weapon. He intended to sell them, to parade them in public. For Sir Peregrine, it was not merely his own dignity at stake but the name of the woman. Pride will let a man suffer himself, love will not let him see another shamed. When he left the study, Peregrine lingered. While Hobbs delivered the letters, he turned the key from outside, entered unseen, and arranged his little drama, the candles, the chalk, the locked door. It was meant as a scare, nothing more, a stage play with one audience member. But pride does not take kindly to being laughed at. Lord Ashcombe laughed. In that moment, Peregrine's plan changed. The pistol was to hand. The shot was quick. He relocked the door from outside, snapped his thread, swept the end under the skirting with his shoe, and walked away believing himself both clever and justified. Lady Ashcombe's voice was level. "And yet he has confessed to you." "Yes," Father Brown said. "And to Inspector Gryce." Gryce grunted. "I'll take him in tonight." The priest looked around the room, his voice softening. "It would be wrong to imagine Sir Peregrine as a monster. He is a man who tried to be clever when he should have been brave, and in the end, his pride proved quicker than his conscience. That's not the same as malice, though the law must still have its answer." Lady Ashcombe's eyes lowered to her hands. "I shall see that the letters go where they should have gone from the beginning, to the fire." Dr. Keene spoke with a dry, quiet firmness. "The truth is often less dramatic than we expect. And more dangerous." "Dangerous," Father Brown agreed, "because it forces us to look at ourselves. It's easy to chase a locked room puzzle, harder to see the locked doors in our own hearts. Pride is one of those locks. So is fear. The key is always inside, but we keep thinking we can open it from without, with tricks and cleverness." Annie shifted against the wall, her voice timid. "Will they hang him, Father?" Father Brown looked at her gently. "That will be for others to decide. But whatever happens, God will judge him as a man who could not bear to see someone he cared for humiliated. That's a sin that can be forgiven, if he'll let it be." There was a long pause. The fire cracked softly. Outside, the last of the fair's organ music floated faintly on the damp air. Finally, Father Brown turned to the inspector. "You'll find him in his rooms. He's ready." Gryce gave a short nod and left without hurry. Lady Ashcombe rose and moved to the window, looking out at the wet lawns. Dr. Keene followed, saying nothing. Annie slipped away toward the servants' passage. Mr. Hobbs began, with quiet efficiency, to clear the tea things. The priest lingered a moment longer by the door, then stepped into the hall. As he passed the study, the circle of candles still lay on the floor, though most had burned themselves to puddles of wax. He bent and blew out the last one. Shadows reclaimed the room, the chalk word now barely visible in the gloom. "Lux," he murmured. "Light should show the truth, not hide it." He put on his hat and walked out into the damp evening. The fair's lights glimmered faintly across the green. Somewhere in the distance, a peacock gave its forlorn cry. Father Brown trudged toward the rectory, thinking, not of locked rooms, but of the harder locks men carry inside them, and of the strange grace that sometimes breaks them open from within.